This is Michael Popok, Legal AF After Dark Edition. The immunity decision by the United States Supreme Court. We've got to figure out how to work our way through it and thread the needle to preserve our democracy. Particularly, how does its three categories of acts, some of which get absolute immunity, some of which get a presumption of immunity that'll be very hard to overcome, and some of which get no immunity, and the Supreme Court MAGA right-wing majority's impact on the ability to use certain types of evidence against a president, former or current, and the ability to use motive or not use motive in trying to suss out what is unofficial conduct. All of that hamstrings the ability to provide checks and balances against a criminal president in the future or the one that could be elected in November. We have a hot and heavy debate about it on Legal AF. Let's talk about the immunity decision because we have to. But we've had enough time now to digest it and sort of dust ourselves up. Yeah, it was a hit to the solar plexus of our democracy. But now we've all picked through the 50 or 60 pages of Chief Justice Roberts, seen the crappy things that Clarence Thomas wrote as a big red signal to
Judge Cannon.
Judge Cannon about maybe Jack Smith's not a properly appointed special counsel and the whole thing can just go away for that reason. But we'll get there in a minute. Let's talk about what you picked up from the immunity decision and then how you think the prosecutors and Judge Chutkan, what do you think she does? How does she call everybody back together? I'm assuming it's going to be next week to bring them back to court to say, all right, we got the judgment. There are certain mandates that have been given to the trial judge by the Supreme Court. They want her to get down to it with a razor blade and look at that indictment and its overt acts and categorize things into core presidential conduct for which there's absolute immunity, presidential official conduct for which there is a presumption that can be overcome if the prosecutors show it's not going to improperly interfere with the exercise of presidential power in that way. And then just unofficial stuff that is naked and doesn't have any immunity protection. Fortunately, we've all looked at that indictment in DC election interference 10 ways to Sunday, and we've always thought that most of it is not is unofficial conduct. Now, there's one caveat. Supreme Court said, don't look at motive. You're not allowed to look at motive. You only can look at whether something is official or unofficial based on, factors not related to motive in categorizing it. And they already went out of their way, even though they said it's really for the trial judge to develop a record here, but they went out of their way to say anything related to Donald Trump's interaction with the Department of Justice, including Jeff Clark and the acting attorney general, is off limits, absolute immunity. We're going to take that off the board right now. So there goes the Jeff Clark and the weaponization of the Department of Justice in the waning days of the Trump administration as part of the prosecution. That's out the window. They've said the Mike Pence one, the interaction and pressure campaign on Mike Pence, may or may not be, depending upon the trial judge determining if this is inside the outer boundaries of executive power official duties about electoral vote counting, which I think is well outside what a president is responsible for. The vice president may be responsible for it, but not the president. That's left to be determined by Judge Chutkan after an evidentiary hearing. And then what is left over, right? What falls into this last bucket and how big is this last bucket to salvage the indictment in the District of Columbia? Why don't you walk through what you saw and how we map this Supreme Court opinion onto the existing indictment in the District of Columbia?
Look, unfortunately, this case, the more you read it, the worse it gets. It's really just a travesty. And on the day before the 4th of July, which is such an important day in our history and in our democracy, you can't help but just really feel that the founding fathers are turning over in their grave at this decision. It is just really, really horrendous. The fact that the president of the United States now is a king, essentially, that he and he alone has absolute criminal immunity for doing his job. There's not a single other job in the country, not a Supreme Court justice, not a member of Congress, who has absolute immunity from criminal prosecution. It is shocking. Absolutely shocking to me that the laws do not apply to him. And when you play it out in the scenarios and you look at kind of how the parade of horribles could be, in addition to the fact that Judge Sotomayor, in her dissent, said the president could use SEAL Team 6 to assassinate his rivals, he's immune. He can bribe, someone in exchange for a pardon, immune. She goes immune, immune, immune. Now, they read each other's opinions. If the majority opinion and Justice Roberts disagreed with her assessment that you would be immune for doing that, if people are saying, oh, that's such an exaggeration, oh, the left is fear mongering, what typically happens is Justice Roberts would take that as an opportunity to say, not true, in the majority opinion, that the dissent says X, it is not X, which essentially is saying to the world, it is true, it is accurate, it is a fair reading of this opinion. And what shocks me the most is, and again, I'm looking at category number 1, his core official duties. I'm looking at the fact that the majority opinion says the Constitution requires the president to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. As such, there is a Department of Justice. They are the ones charged with taking care that the laws are faithfully executed. Therefore, you want to encourage a robust, don't look over your shoulder presidency where he'll talk to his attorney general and make sure that the laws are faithfully executed. And therefore, you are immune from being prosecuted, even if you commit a crime in that context, right? Think about that. Think about whoever he's going to install as the Attorney General of the United States. It's going to be someone who's loyal to him and somebody who it essentially pledges allegiance to him as opposed to the United States Constitution. If he asks them to commit a crime on his behalf, go after my political rivals, go assassinate go shoot someone, they can be prosecuted for it. He can't. He cannot. And you're not even allowed to look at his motives. You're not even allowed to talk about it. You're not allowed to do anything because of this ruling. He is absolutely immune from crimes if it had anything to do with his core constitutional duties. Now, I know a lot of people say, why didn't Tanya Chutkan, the judge in the district court, make a record below about what's official and unofficial? And then we wouldn't be wasting all this time now that we're going to have this mini trial, and we'll talk about that in a minute. I think it's because it is so perplexing that anyone, how could committing a crime ever be in your job description? How could you ever be doing your job or in any way carrying out your duties if you're committing a crime? It just is such a head scratcher to me. So that in and of itself, to me, is just unbelievable that they would say that. Number one. Number two, the next category that you were talking about, the presumption of immunity, the presumption that the president gets. Once again, yet another kind of elevate him to a status that is above Supreme Court justices, that it's above members of Congress. They're supposed to be separate but equal. You're not supposed to have one that is higher than the other. And it's just very interesting that the Supreme Court is essentially consolidating power in one branch of government. And interestingly, there's another case that came down this week that overruled something called the Chevron doctrine, that the Chevron doctrine basically said, and if we have time, I'm sure we'll talk about it, but it essentially talks about what powers administrative agencies have, right? The Environmental Protection Agency, whatever it is, all the agencies that exist in the executive branch that are tasked under the Administrative Procedures Act, they exist in order to carry out the laws that Congress passes. Historically, under Chevron for the last 40 years, the administrative the agencies had a lot of power and a lot of authority, and the court took that away and consolidated it with themselves, right? They said, no, only the courts have power. So it's essentially what they're doing is they're consolidating power with themselves and the courts, and they are giving the president even more power. It is just incredibly just surprising and shocking to me, this decision and all of the decisions. It's hard for me to parse them out and say, oh, this one's worse than that. This one is truly the worst.
Welcome back. These are important matters at the intersection of law and politics. It matters to our constitutional republic, and we take it seriously. We may not always agree, but we ultimately come to the right place in a humane and dignified debate that we call Legal AF. The podcast is every Wednesday and Saturday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and then on audio podcast platforms of your choice. We sit at the intersection of law and politics. We curate the top 3 or 4 or 5 stories at that intersection that we think you need to know, and we bring it to you the only way we know how, without blowing smoke, without blowing sunshine, without pandering, without coming up with a narrative and then trying to prove the narrative. We just tell it like it is as lawyers who practice for a long time in the courts and court systems that we talk about. Lawyers talking about things, they know what they're talking about. Refreshing here on YouTube and on the MeidasTouch network. You can free subscribe, help them get the 3 million. It's our exclusive platform. It's an independent, no outside investor network. It's only because you're free subscribing and you're watching and listening and commenting and rating us that keeps us on the air. So until my next hot take, until my next Legal AF, this is Michael Popok reporting. Heary, Legal AF Law Breakdown is now in session. Go beyond the headlines and get a deep dive into the important legal concepts you need to know, and we discuss every day on Legal AF. Exclusive content you won't find anywhere else, all for the price of a couple of cups of coffee. Join us at patreon.com/legalaf. That's patreon.com/legalaf.